October 27, 1962, 300 miles north of Cuba. Submarine B-59 is underwater, has been underwater for days. The temperature inside the pressure hull is 140 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe higher. The thermometers only go to 140. The air is thick, unbreathable, tastes like metal and sweat and fear. Captain Valentin Savitsky stands in the control room. He's drenched in sweat. Everyone is drenched in sweat. The crew has been at battle stations for hours. They're being depth charged. American destroyers above them dropping explosives. The charges detonate with metallic cracks that echo through the hull. Each explosion feels like a hammer hitting the submarine. The lights flicker. Pipes groan. Men flinch. They've been running submerged for too long. The batteries are dying. The air scrubbers can't keep up with the carbon dioxide. Men are passing out. Some are hallucinating. The doctors moving through the compartments trying to revive people, giving oxygen from emergency bottles, but there are only so many bottles. Savitsky knows he has a decision to make. He knows what the Americans are doing. They're trying to force him to surface. Standard anti-submarine warfare tactics. Depth charges aren't meant to sink the submarine, not yet. They're meant to harass, to frighten, to make the submarine captain decide surfacing is better than dying underwater. But Savitsky doesn't know if surfacing means survival or capture or death. He has no communication with Moscow, no orders, no updates. The last radio contact was days ago. For all he knows, World War III has started. The depth charges could be warning shots before they use real weapons, or they could be the opening moves of a war that will kill everyone. He looks at the political officer, Ivan Maslenikov. In the Soviet Navy, important decisions require agreement from three men: the captain, the political officer, and the second in command. This is not a democracy. But on a submarine carrying nuclear weapons, one man cannot make the decision alone. Savitsky and Maslenikov are ready to launch. They believe war has started. They believe they're under attack. They believe their orders are clear. If threatened, if war begins, they should use their weapon, the special weapon. The nuclear torpedo sitting in tube number 2. But there's a third man, Vasily Arkhipov. He's the brigade chief of staff. He's on board B-59 as an observer. Technically, he's outranked by the captain on tactical decisions. But for the nuclear weapon, his vote counts equally. Captain, political officer, brigade commander, all three must agree. And Arkhipov is saying no. This is the moment that saves the world, though nobody knows it. Not the Americans dropping depth charges, not the other Soviet submarines in the area, not the Soviet commanders in Moscow or the American commanders in Washington. Nobody knows that the fate of humanity is being decided in a sweltering submarine by three men arguing in Russian while explosions echo through the hull. The story of how we got here starts 2 weeks earlier, October 14, 1962. An American U-2 spy plane photographed Soviet missile sites being constructed in Cuba. Medium-range ballistic missiles, nuclear-armed, capable of hitting Washington, New York, most of the eastern United States. President John F. Kennedy is informed. The ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, convenes. They debate options: airstrikes to destroy the missiles, invasion of Cuba, diplomatic pressure, naval blockade. They choose blockade. Call it a quarantine because blockades are acts of war and nobody wants to start a war. Not yet. October 22nd, Kennedy addresses the nation. He reveals the missiles, announces the quarantine. Soviet ships approaching Cuba will be stopped and searched. Any carrying offensive weapons will be turned back. The United States is prepared to use force if necessary. The speech is measured, calm, but the message is clear. This is a crisis. This could become a war. The Soviet Union responds with outrage. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, calls the quarantine piracy an act of aggression. He orders Soviet ships to ignore it, to proceed to Cuba, to deliver their cargo. Neither side is backing down. Both sides are mobilizing forces. American strategic bombers go to DEFCON 2, one step below war. Soviet forces in Cuba are put on full alert, and 4 Soviet submarines are ordered to proceed to Cuba, to challenge the quarantine, to protect Soviet interests. These are Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines, B-4, B-36, B-59, and B-130. Each carries a crew of 78 men. Each carries conventional torpedoes, and each carries 1 nuclear torpedo, a special weapon, 10 to 15 kiloton yield, equivalent to the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The captains are given instructions, vague instructions. They're authorized to use the nuclear torpedoes if they're under attack, if war has begun. The definition of under attack is left to their judgment. The assumption is they'll have radio contact with Moscow. They'll know if war starts. They'll receive clear orders, but they won't have radio contact. The submarines will be operating independently, submerged most of the time, unable to receive messages except when they surface to periscope depth, and they'll be hunted. The U.S. Navy knows Soviet submarines are coming. They're deploying destroyers and aircraft to find them, to track them, to force them to surface. B-59 leaves the Kola Peninsula on October 1st, Captain Valentin Savitsky commanding. The mission is to reach Cuba, to establish a submarine presence, to support the Soviet military buildup. The voyage south is routine at first, submerged during the day, surfaced at night to recharge batteries and get fresh air. The crew settles into the rhythm, but as they approach the Caribbean, things change. American anti-submarine forces are everywhere. P-2 Neptune patrol aircraft, S-2 tracker aircraft from carriers, destroyers with sonar. They're searching systematically, setting up barriers. The submarines are walking into a trap. October 23rd, B-59 is detected by American sonar. The hunt begins. Destroyers close in. They don't try to sink the submarine. They try to force it to surface. They drop practice depth charges. These are small explosive charges, signal charges, designed to make noise, to tell the submarine they have been found. International maritime law says submarines should surface when detected, should identify themselves, should communicate. But Savitsky doesn't surface. He goes deeper, runs silent, tries to evade. The Americans follow. They're good at this. Their sonar is better than Soviet sonar. Their tactics are refined by years of Cold War practice. They track B-59 through the ocean, drop more depth charges, not enough to damage the submarine, just enough to harass it, to remind it that it's being hunted. The harassment continues for days. B-59 can't surface without being detected, can't run the diesel engines without surfacing. The batteries are draining. The submarine is running on battery power constantly, trying to evade, trying to hide. The batteries are designed for short-term submerged operations, hours, not days. But they've been submerged for days. The systems are failing. The air conditioning is gone. The heat from the batteries and the machinery and the men has nowhere to go. The temperature climbs. 100 degrees, 110, 20 higher. The air is soup. Men strip to their underwear. Some can't wear even that. The heat is unbearable. The carbon dioxide builds up. The air scrubbers use chemicals to remove CO2 from the air, but the chemicals are consumed. The scrubbers are overwhelmed. The air becomes toxic. Men get headaches, nausea, confusion, some collapse. The doctor moves through the boat with oxygen, reviving men. But the oxygen bottles are finite. October 27th, the depth charging intensifies. Multiple destroyers now. USS Coney, USS Murray, USS Beale. They've formed a barrier. They're not letting B-59 escape. They're dropping charges continuously. The explosions are closer, louder. The submarine shudders with each hit. The crew is at the breaking point. They've been in these conditions for days. Heat, bad air, constant noise, no communication with home, no orders, no information about what's happening. For all they know, the war has started. For all they know, these depth charges are the opening shots. Savitsky is a proud man, a good officer, but he's been pushed too far. His submarine is dying. His crew is dying. He's being attacked by American destroyers who are trying to humiliate him, force him to surface, to surrender. He's a Soviet naval officer. He doesn't surrender. He calls the senior officers to the control room. Maslenikov, the political officer. Arkhipov, the brigade commander. Other officers. He tells them his decision. They will surface, but not to surrender. They will surface and fight. They will use the special weapon, the nuclear torpedo. They will fire it at the American ships. If war has started, this is their duty. If war hasn't started, they'll start it, but they will not surrender. Maslenikov agrees immediately. He's the political officer. His job is to ensure political reliability, to prevent deviation from Soviet orders. The orders say they can use the nuclear weapon if they're under attack. They're clearly under attack. The decision is obvious. But Arkhipov says no. This is extraordinary. Arkhipov is not the captain. He's senior in the overall command structure, but Savitsky commands this boat. In normal circumstances, the captain's word is law. But these aren't normal circumstances. The use of nuclear weapons requires unanimous agreement. Captain, political officer, and Arkhipov, all three must vote yes, and Arkhipov is voting no. The argument that follows is heated. Savitsky is furious. They're being attacked. The Americans are trying to sink them or capture them. Either way, it's war. The special weapon should be used. That's what it's for. Arkhipov argues they don't know if war has started. The depth charges are harassment, not attack. If the Americans wanted to sink them, they'd use real depth charges. These are signals. They're trying to force communication, not destruction. Savitsky counters that they have no communication with Moscow, no orders, no information. They're operating independently. The captain must make decisions based on the situation. And the situation is they're under attack. Arkhipov says launching a nuclear weapon will start World War III. Even if war hasn't started yet, it will start the moment the torpedo detonates. The Americans will retaliate. Moscow will retaliate. Everyone will retaliate. It will be the end. The argument continues. The temperature is unbearable. The air is barely breathable. Men are listening from their stations. Everyone knows what's being discussed. Everyone knows what's at stake. Some support Savitsky. They want to fight. They want to use the weapon. They're Soviet sailors, and they don't surrender. Others support Arkhipov. They don't want to die. They don't want to start a war that kills everyone. They want to surface, to end this nightmare, even if it means humiliation. Another depth charge explodes, the closest yet. The lights go out completely for a moment. Emergency lighting flickers on. The hull groans. Something breaks somewhere in the engineering spaces. The men wait for water to start pouring in. It doesn't. Not yet. Savitsky makes his argument one more time. They're under attack. They have the weapon. They should use it. It's their duty. Arkhipov stands firm. No, they will not use the weapon. They will surface. They will signal the Americans. They will establish communication. They will avoid starting a war that will kill millions. The moment stretches. Savitsky could order the launch anyway. He's the captain, but he knows the order won't be followed. Not without Archipov's agreement. The weapons officer won't arm the torpedo. The crew won't support it. Archipov's word carries weight. He's respected. He's survived things that would have killed other men. Vasily Arkhipov is 36 years old. He's been in the Soviet Navy for years. He was second in command on submarine K-19 in 1961. That submarine had a reactor accident. A cooling pipe ruptured. The reactor core was overheating, heading toward meltdown. If the reactor melted down, the nuclear warheads on board would detonate. The submarine would be destroyed. The crew would die, and the explosion might trigger war with the United States. The captain of K-19, Nikolai Zatayev, ordered the crew to repair the cooling system manually. This meant entering the reactor compartment. The radiation levels were lethal. The men who went in knew they were dead. They went anyway. They jury-rigged a cooling system. They saved the reactor. They saved the submarine. Arkhipov was part of the damage control effort. He was exposed to radiation, not as much as the men who entered the reactor compartment. 8 of them died within days. 15 more died within 2 years. But Arkhipov was exposed. He absorbed enough radiation to cause health problems for the rest of his life. He survived K-19 because of discipline and training and following procedures. He learned that panic kills, that rash decisions kill, that following protocol and thinking clearly saves lives. He's applying that lesson now on B-59. In this moment, when one rash decision could kill not just the crew, but millions. Savitsky sees Arkhipov won't change his mind. He sees the crew supports Arkhipov. He makes the decision they will surface. They will not use the special weapon. Not today. The orders go out. Surface the boat. All hands prepare for surface operations. The submarine's ballast tanks blow. Compressed air forces the water out. The submarine rises. The depth gauge unwinds. 300 feet, 200 feet, 100 feet, they breach. The sunlight is blinding after days underwater. The fresh air is incredible. The heat begins to dissipate immediately. The conning tower hatch opens. Officers climb out. They signal the American ships. We are Soviet submarine B-59. We are not hostile. We require communication. The American destroyers maintain distance. They don't board the submarine. They don't try to capture it. They acknowledge the signal. They request the submarine proceed on the surface to international waters, away from Cuba, away from the quarantine zone. Savitsky complies. He has no choice. The batteries are dead. The crew is exhausted. The submarine is barely functional. They proceed on the surface, diesel engines running, charging the batteries, getting air to the compartments. The crew recovers slowly. The Americans shadow them. Destroyers maintaining visual contact, making sure B-59 leaves the area. After 24 hours, the Americans break off. B-59 is outside the quarantine zone, heading back toward the Soviet Union. The immediate crisis is over. On board B-59, the crew is silent. They know what almost happened. They know how close they came. Some are angry they didn't fight, didn't use the weapon, They feel humiliated, forced to surface by the Americans. Others are relieved, grateful to be alive. Grateful war didn't start. Arkhipov says nothing. He doesn't celebrate. He doesn't gloat. He just does his job. He writes reports. He monitors the crew. He helps get the submarine back to base. In Washington and Moscow, nobody knows what happened. The Americans know they forced a Soviet submarine to surface. One of several encounters during the crisis. It's noted in reports, logged. But nobody realizes how close that submarine came to launching a nuclear weapon. In Moscow, the submarine's failure to reach Cuba is noted. The harassment by American forces is noted. But there's no indication anyone knows about the argument in the control room, about the vote, about Archipov's refusal. The Cuban Missile Crisis continues for a few more days. On October 28th, Khrushchev announces the Soviet Union will remove the missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the United States promises not to invade Cuba. Secretly, the U.S. agrees to remove missiles from Turkey. The crisis ends. War is avoided. But it was closer than anyone knew. October 27th is later called Black Saturday, the day the crisis came closest to nuclear war. An American U-2 is shot down over Cuba. The pilot killed. A U-2 strays into Soviet airspace over Siberia. Could have been shot down. Should have been shot down. Soviet and American forces are at hair-trigger alert. Any incident could escalate. And under the ocean north of Cuba, 3 men in a submarine argued about launching a nuclear weapon. 2 voted yes. 1 voted no. The no vote won. If Arkhipov had voted yes, the nuclear torpedo would have been fired. It would have detonated among the American destroyers. At least one would have been destroyed. Possibly several. Hundreds of American sailors would have died instantly. More would have died from radiation. The American response would have been immediate, probably nuclear, probably targeted at the submarine that fired, possibly targeted at other Soviet submarines in the area, Soviet vessels in Cuba. The escalation would have been unstoppable. Moscow would have interpreted American nuclear use as the start of war. They would have launched against American forces in Europe, against American cities. The United States would have responded with everything: strategic bombers, ICBMs, SLBMs. The Soviet Union would have done the same. Within hours, hundreds of nuclear weapons would have detonated in Europe, in the Soviet Union, in the United States. Millions would have died in the first day, tens of millions in the first week. The radiation, the fallout, the nuclear winter, the collapse of civilization. All of this didn't happen because one man said no. Arkhipov returns to the Soviet Union. He's not punished for the decision. He's not celebrated either. The incident is classified. Nobody talks about it. The Soviet Navy continues operating submarines. The Cold War continues. Arkhipov continues his career. He's promoted. He commands submarines. He serves in staff positions. He becomes a rear admiral. He has a successful career. But his health deteriorates. The radiation exposure from K-19, the stress from years of submarine duty. He develops cancer, kidney cancer. It spreads. He retires in the 1980s. He lives quietly with his wife, Olga. He doesn't talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, doesn't talk about B-59, doesn't talk about the decision. His wife knows something happened, but he won't discuss it. It's classified, and even if it wasn't, he's not the type to brag. The story only emerges after the Cold War ends. In the 1990s, historians start interviewing Soviet veterans, declassifying documents, Piecing together what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they learn about the 4 submarines, about the nuclear torpedoes, about the encounters with American forces. They interview Vadim Orlov, who is a signals officer on B-59. He tells the story about the heat, the depth charging, the argument, the vote, Archipov's refusal to authorize the launch. The story spreads. Historians realize how close the world came. They start calling Arkhipov the man who saved the world. The phrase is not hyperbole, it's accurate. Without his no vote, nuclear war would have started on October 27, 1962. Thomas Blanton, director of the National Security Archive, says it plainly. A guy called Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. But Arkhipov doesn't live to see the recognition. He dies on August 19, 1998. He's 72 years old. The cancer wins. He's buried with military honors. His wife attends. His daughters attend. Some naval colleagues. It's a small ceremony. Quiet. The way he would have wanted. His obituary in Russian newspapers is brief. Rear Admiral Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov died after long illness, survived by wife and 2 daughters. No mention of saving the world, no mention of B-59, no mention of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The recognition comes later. After his death, historians write articles, books, documentaries. The United Nations recognizes his contribution to peace. In 2017, his wife Olga accepts the Future of Life Award on his behalf. The award given to people who have made extraordinary contributions to safeguarding humanity. But Arkhipov isn't here to receive it. He's been dead for 19 years. He never knew he was famous, never knew he was celebrated. He just did his job, made the right decision, went home. The other men in the story have different fates. Captain Savitsky continues his naval career. He's not punished for surfacing. He's not blamed for failing to reach Cuba. He eventually retires, dies in the 1990s. He never talks about the vote, about the argument, about what almost happened. Ivan Maslenikov, the political officer who voted yes, also continues his career, also retires, also dies without commenting publicly. The Soviet Navy doesn't encourage its officers to talk about classified operations, especially operations that went wrong, or almost went catastrophically wrong. The crew of B-59 scatter to other assignments. Some stay in the Navy, some leave. They carry the memory of those days in October. The heat, the depth charges, the fear. Some have nightmares, some drink, some seem fine. They almost started World War III. Then they went home, and nobody knew. The Americans who hunted B-59 don't know either. The destroyer crews dropping depth charges. They think they're conducting standard anti-submarine warfare, harassing a Soviet submarine, forcing it to surface. They don't know the submarine is carrying a nuclear weapon, don't know how close they came to being vaporized. The practice depth charges they dropped were meant to signal, not destroy. If they had known about the nuclear torpedo, they might have acted differently, might have used real depth charges, might have tried to sink the submarine before it could launch, or might have kept their distance, avoided provoking it, but they didn't know. And B-59 didn't launch, and everyone went home alive. The question that haunts historians is what if? What if Arkhipov hadn't been on B-59? What if he'd been on one of the other submarines, B-4 or B-36 or B-130? What if one of those submarines had been depth charged, had the same argument, but without Arkhipov there to vote no? The other brigade commanders might have voted yes, probably would have. 2 officers saying launch, 1 saying launch, no dissent. The torpedo would have been fired, war would have started. Or what if Arkhipov had been killed on K-19? The radiation exposure could have killed him. He was exposed enough that it caused cancer later. A little more exposure, and he would have died in 1961. Someone else would have been on B-59 in 1962. Someone without his experience, without his temperament, without his ability to say no under pressure. The fact that Arkhipov survived K-19 to be on B-59 is random chance, lucky chance. The fact that he was calm enough and strong enough to refuse the launch is character. But character plus chance equals survival. For him, for the crew, for the world. The people who were alive on October 27, 1962, owe their survival to many people, to Kennedy and Khrushchev, who chose communication over war, to the military officers on both sides who followed orders instead of starting fights, to the technicians who maintained the weapons and didn't have accidents, to the diplomats who kept talking when talking seemed useless, but especially to Vasily Arkhipov, who said no, who refused to authorize nuclear launch, who endured the heat and the bad air and the anger of his captain and the fear of his crew, who stood firm, who saved the world. The lesson of Arkhipov is that individual decisions matter, that one person can make a difference, that courage isn't always about fighting. Sometimes courage is refusing to fight, saying no when everyone else says yes, standing alone when it would be easier to go along. Arkhipov stood alone, in a submarine, under the ocean, in a 140-degree heat, with bad air and depth charges exploding and his captain demanding action. He said no, and that no echoes through history. Every person alive today is alive partially because of that decision. The children who were born after 1962, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, billions of people who would never have existed if nuclear war had started in 1962. They don't know Arkipov's name. Most people don't. He's not famous like Kennedy or Khrushchev. He didn't get monuments or holidays. He died quietly, was buried quietly. His grave in Moscow is simple, no indication that the man buried there saved the world. But he did. On October 27, 1962, under the Atlantic Ocean, in Submarine B-59, when he voted no. Remember Vasily Arkhipov not as abstract hero but as real person, naval officer doing his job, submarine veteran with radiation damage, husband and father, man who lived through K-19 and learned that panic kills, man who applied that lesson when it mattered most. Remember that nuclear war was prevented not by grand strategy but by one man's judgment, one vote, one refusal, 3 men in a submarine. 2 voted to launch, 1 voted no. The no won. Remember that we're all here because he said no, that the world didn't end because one man kept his head while others lost theirs. That civilization survived because Vasily Arkhipov, 36-year-old Soviet naval officer, made the right decision in the worst circumstances. Remember that heroes don't always charge into battle. Sometimes they prevent battles. Sometimes they stand in the way of destruction and say no. Sometimes they save the world by refusing to end it. This is Vasily Arkhipov's story. October 27, 1962, Submarine B-59. 3 men, 1 vote. The world saved because one man said no when everyone else said yes. The man who saved the world, who died unknown, who deserves to be remembered.